Hello, everyone, and welcome to this week's episode of Unleash Your Voice. I'm your host, Priya Sam, and today's guest is Laurie Wetzel, a former executive leader at companies including Slack, Adobe, and Salesforce. She is now a career strategist for professionals navigating real high-stakes career decisions. After spending more than 25 years inside the rooms where roles are shaped, scope is decided, and promotions are made, Laurie saw a pattern most career advice misses. Advancement at senior levels isn't about effort, it's about how that effort is interpreted by decision makers. Her work now focuses on clarity over grind, judgment over heroics, and helping high-performing leaders make their experience legible, trusted, and in demand. She is the creator of the Standout Advantage framework and the 3P method, and she works with senior ICs, leaders, and executives across product, go-to-market, and operations. If you've ever felt like you're doing the work but not being chosen for it in the right rooms, this is the conversation for you. Thank you so much for being here, Laurie.
Thank you, Priya. I'm excited to be talking to you today.
I'm excited too, and I'm going to start with a question I ask all of my guests. Tell me about a time in your career when you unleashed your voice.
Okay, well, for most of my career, working hard and delivering served me, and I would default to letting my work do the talking for me. And that was my playbook for a lot of my career for a long time, and it worked. And then I encountered a leader that came in above me who seemed to have some real bias and also very little experience in what our team actually did. And he started building narratives about my team and about me that just weren't aligned and weren't true. And the truth was, I had the title and I had this long track record. I had the comp and I definitely needed the job. So, really, the smart move would have been, at least on paper, to keep my head down so I could keep the job. But I realized at that moment that staying quiet was not protecting me. It was actually letting this false story become the story. And once that narrative starts traveling through the right rooms, it sticks. So I decided to speak up directly and clearly and really on the record. And it wasn't coming from a place of anger, but just out of clarity about what I did and what was true. And so this is what my team had built. This is who I am. And that's how I was relaying the information. And it didn't fix everything, but it definitely changed something in me permanently. And here is what I know to be true. Your narrative is either something you shape or it's something that gets shaped for you. And the people making decisions about your career are working with whichever version they have. And so that's, what I learned out of that experience and what I do with my work today with professionals, that you don't have to become that loud person in the room, but you need to be someone who is clearer so that the right story about you is already in the room before any conversation even starts.
That's so powerful. And I really appreciate that you learned from your own experience and that now you're using that to help other people. Because you're right. I mean, we all have a personal brand, whether we're building it intentionally or not. And I know that you have seen that firsthand for yourself, but also as a leader, right? You've been the hiring manager, the executive sponsor, the person making judgment calls about scope and promotions. So, what do people outside of those rooms most misunderstand about how decisions are actually made at senior levels?
Yes, it's a great question, Priya. Okay, I recently wrote an article on this because I do think it's something that people often don't think about. Because most people think decisions happen in that very moment, like there's a meeting and a name comes up and the room decides, but it's not how it works. The decision is 80% made before anyone walks in that door. And what happens in that meeting is mostly people validating a narrative that was already formed in the hallway conversations and in meetings. By the time your name is on the agenda, the story about you already exists. So the second thing people may get wrong is thinking decision makers are evaluating only the work itself. But when you get to senior levels, they're also evaluating something bigger than the work. And that is, can I count on this person with more responsibility? Honestly, they also look at, will they make me look smart for championing them? They're putting their own brand out on their behalf. Could I put them in a room to represent me and the team and feel confident about walking away and not being there with them? And what I would see often is high performers doing generally exceptional work who have never actively shaped how that work was perceived. So when their name came up, the narrative was kind of vague, like, oh, she'd be great. But no one could articulate like exactly why or what she would do with more scope. So that vague praise does not get you promoted. It's the specific, believable stories that do. And what can be very frustrating is that these were often the same people watching someone who they may have felt was less experienced move ahead of them, and then maybe just chalking it up to, oh, that's office politics. And look, sometimes that is real, but often the issue is a visibility problem. And that is something that you could actually change.
I really love that you mentioned stories because, of course, that is what I am so passionate about. And I work with my clients a lot on. But I think one of the big takeaways from what you just said is really around you being clear on your story and then making sure that other people, like decision makers, are clear on your story too, so that they can repeat it and say it in the rooms that you aren't in.
I worked with a client who recently, who had been at her company for 6 years. She had led a pretty significant product launch that brought in like $4 million in new revenue. She had managed a cross functional team through a whole reorg without losing a single high performing person. So, by anyone's measure, she was doing exceptional level work. And when she approached her manager, and having a conversation about next step to VP, she got this feedback, what like very vague, you need more experience. And she walked out and she did what many high performers do. She didn't push back necessarily. She didn't really ask what that meant, but she did take on more work. She took on another initiatives. She volunteered for another committee, showing up earlier, staying later, really working through effort to try to close a gap that really wasn't defined by anyone. So 6 months of that and nothing changed. Not the feedback, not her trajectory. The only thing that really changed was how she was feeling about the work. So here's what I told her. More experience, that more experience feedback is rarely a diagnosis. It's a placeholder. And you typically get that from people. They say that when something feels unclear about your readiness, but they can't even name it. And that vagueness is a signal, not about your capability, but about how your capability is being perceived in the rooms where decisions get made. So when I asked her who in leadership could describe the full scope of what she was doing, she paused and said, my direct manager, probably. And that was like a light bulb moment because the people making decisions about her future did not have a clear picture of what she was already operating at. Her results were strong. The story around those results was not reaching those people. So once we changed how her work was framed and who had visibility into it and how she showed up in the conversations that mattered, that more experienced feedback just disappeared. And it's not because she had more time and more experience. It's because the people evaluating her finally understood what she had been doing all along. And again, it was that visibility problem, not a performance one.
I know that so many people listening right now are nodding along and also probably having their own light bulb moments because I can think back to a time in my own career when I experienced the same thing. Oh, and I should mention, like, Laurie actually used to be my boss. You were in my interview actually when I got hired at Slack. And so it's so interesting to really hear from you of like what's happening on the other side in these rooms that you were in.
Well, and I think it's amazing because obviously getting hired at Slack, you knew how to tell a good story about your career and the impact. And so to see you now do that at scale for others is just amazing to watch.
Well, I've loved also seeing, and I love that our work is so complementary as well. So
Same.
it's really cool, yeah, to be on this journey together. You mentioned a little bit earlier about, one of your core beliefs is really that you don't need to be louder, you need to be clearer. So I'm curious, how did you learn this lesson in your own career?
Yeah, by making the opposite mistake, Priya, and not understanding why it wasn't working. Oh my gosh, so much of what I learned is by my own trial and error. But I finally recognized I needed more visibility. And initially, my instinct was to just do more, similar to the client I just described, more updates, more emails, more presence in meetings, claiming my space in meetings, like all these tips that you hear. I thought that volume and that effort would solve the issue. But what I found out was instead that being louder or putting that more effort without having that clear through line just created noise. So people knew I was active, they knew I was busy, but they still couldn't articulate what I stood for or what made me distinctly valuable. So volume and clarity are just not the same thing. Clarity means that when someone hears your name in a room that you're not in, they can finish your sentence, right? They know your angle, they know your lens, they know the specific kind of problems you solve that others don't. They know what you're working towards. So that is that positioning question. It's not being present. And I just watched this play out too on the hiring side and hundreds of interviews that I've done over probably thousands over the 25 years. The candidates who stood out were never the ones who spoke the most. They were the ones, like yourself, with a very coherent story where they had been, what they had built, what it meant, where they are going, and what it mattered for me as a hiring manager. So that coherence read as confidence, credibility, and readiness in a way that, more stories, more volume never could. So that's where it comes back to you don't need to be louder, but you need to be clearer.
And okay, there are so many good nuggets in that answer.
Okay.
I think the strategy that a lot of people default to when they don't have that clarity is they just dump everything out, right? It's like that throw spaghetti at the wall and see what
Yes.
sticks. And so I think like this advice about it's better to have brevity and clarity, right? Than these elaborate answers that really don't have a clear focus. That's a really important takeaway.
Yeah, it really makes a difference because you want others to be able to repeat your story. And the more noise you create around the story, the harder it is for them to grab the takeaways. So if you can't succinctly describe how you're different, right? There's a lot of people with the same title. Just look on LinkedIn. Like, so what is different about the way you approach your work? And how do you essentially package that up so that you can, in a very concise way, articulate it to somebody who asks, whether you're on the line at the coffee shop or you're in an interview or you're at a skip level? You need to be able to say it in a way that that person can now take it and repeat it in the meetings they're in where decisions are being made.
Absolutely. And you're such a great example of the work that you do because even just your answers on this podcast, I'm like, everything is like focused, clear. You have an example. And I know that's one of the things your clients also benefit from when working with you. You have such clear frameworks that you use. And one that I've seen you post about a few times on LinkedIn, and that is really powerful is your framework around the 3 levers that get people promoted. So could you walk us through those levers and explain how they show up in real promotion or scope expansion conversations?
Yes. But before we go there, I do want to say one thing because I know sometimes it can get confusing when we talk about like visibility. So I want to name something that may be running through some minds right now, if you don't mind.
Yeah.
some people might confuse like visibility with like, is this just personal branding? And think like they have to become like an influencer on LinkedIn. And that's not what needs to happen. So this is more about you just getting clarity in being who you are and what you offer and being able to communicate it in a way that's authentic to you. Some people like to be on places like LinkedIn and posting content. Other people like to do it in another way. So it's finding not just your voice and being clearer, but finding the authentic way to share it. So I just wanted to call that out because that is something that comes up often. And I don't want to confuse people with like visibility being maybe sometimes I find this, I don't know if you do, but with a lot of my clients, like I know people at work that are always up and talking, or they're always seem to be pointing to their work. And, that might work for that person and that's fine, but it doesn't have to be the same way that you do it, in the way that you articulate your values. So just something to keep in mind, find your authentic way to do it. But now to answer your question specifically, I have a couple of frameworks, but I'll start here because it's the starting point, and I'll talk about 4 levers that matter for just promotions and hiring, and then we can talk about some other stuff in my frameworks. But the 4 primary levers that I use with my clients, and also when I was leading, each one builds on itself. So we start with like defining your edge. So that's everything we've just been talking about. Before anything else, you have to get clear what makes you distinctly valuable, not your title, not your resume, but actually what is the work and what you uniquely bring to it. The problem you solve that others do not. What most people skip this entirely. So that's why and everyone ends up sounding like each other. So you want to get very clear on how you're different. Then you want to build presence. So once you know your clear value, your edge, your digital presence needs to communicate it for you around the clock. Think about it this way, and this happens all the time. When someone Googles you before a meeting, when your name comes up in a conversation and someone pulls up your LinkedIn, when a decision maker is doing their homework before an interview brief, what is your presence saying about you in those moments when you're not in the room? Like everyone's probably frantically pulling up their LinkedIn right now because that's usually what happens. But most people have a presence that's either outdated, generic, completely silent. They think, oh, I have a job, so I don't need to update it. The work here is getting intentional about what you want to say and then making sure the right people are actually seeing it, not like vanity metrics, but the right engagement with the right audience so that it compounds over time in your favor. Then third, you want to master those moments. Knowing your value and being visible is not enough to go blank when it counts, right? People freeze up because they're not comfortable in speaking about themselves. So interviews, executive conversations, high stake pitches. This is about being ready when it actually matters. And then lastly is leading your growth. And this is where it all comes together. It's about building those authentic connections so that the people making decisions already know exactly who you are before a decision ever needs to be made. Because in reality, whether it's a promotion discussion where a manager's pitching their team members or an interview debrief, there are usually just minutes when someone can put their neck out to advocate for you. They're putting their own professional brand out there, and they usually only have about 2 minutes to do it. So, do you want them to use that time trying to explain who you are? Or do you want the room to already know? So, that's the goal. It's not just to be visible or seen more. It's the right people knowing the right things about you before that moment even arises. So, that's the foundation of how I see clients and people get promoted or find new opportunities.
Absolutely. I'm like nodding along because it's logical, it's clear. And I really appreciate that you brought up that point earlier around authenticity and really being yourself through all of this and not having to change your personality to stand out. And as a leader, one of the reasons I was really excited to come to Slack was because when I saw you in my interview and I was like, wow, there are women like Laurie in senior leadership roles. And I always found you to be so authentic. You were the same person in a one-on-one meeting as you were in a boardroom, when you were leading a session, when you were delivering great news, when you were delivering difficult news. Like you had this trustworthiness about you. But I know that can't have always been easy because you were a woman in spaces dominated by men all throughout your career in tech. So, did that impact the decisions you made about roles for yourself, roles that you either left or accepted, or companies you chose to work at?
Absolutely. And I definitely have many stories I could share about that experience, but there were definitely rooms I could see were not built for me to succeed at the level I was capable of. And not because anyone said anything directly. The signals were there if you knew how to read them, who got the stretch assignments, whose ideas got picked up in meetings, whose name was said with like more emphasis or weight. And I paid attention to those patterns and then started making choices accordingly. It wasn't initially in my career, it took some, hard learning, I would say. But at some point, I started realizing that I had to make a change. And so then I started gravitating towards companies and leaders who had already demonstrated, not just stated on some slide, that they valued diverse thinking at the top. So at Slack, for example, I saw that culture modeled. It was the top reason I wanted to be there and why I poured myself into the work I did there. What I also know now, looking back, is that I defaulted initially to this in my career, to a very humble caretaking mode. And I think partly because of how women in leadership get socialized. And then this internalized sense that you should not be too much. And so I was operating with a self imposed feeling, and I didn't fully recognize that until I stopped. So a lot of my clients, especially women in senior tech roles, are carrying very similar weight around. And the thing that nobody talks about is that that is an interpretation problem, not just systemic. So for many of them, it's internalized as well. So you'll face that systemic challenge, unfortunately, but also think about how a narrative you're putting on yourself is shaping how you're moving forward. And I experienced both.
Yeah, one of the things I find myself saying to my clients a lot, especially when they say something like, "Oh, but I don't want to say I too much because I don't want to come across as bragging or being arrogant." And it's like, I mean, as you have said multiple times, like you have to make your impact clear. And
Yes.
also sometimes I just say to them, "I've literally never heard a man say that." And I find like that's actually a good perspective shift to be like, "Oh yeah," because if it's exactly what you just said. We're socialized to do those things, right? To stay in the background, to say we, to give other people credit, to keep humility at the forefront of everything we do
Yeah.
and say.
Yeah. And as a result, it's how we show up without even realizing. So, and that's not to say that those systemic things aren't happening because we've all seen them, but we can control what we can control. So, what are we internalizing or how are we operating that may also be holding us back? And a great place to start to try to change that is understanding who you are, be grounded in that. That will give you the confidence you need. So when you find yourself in that situation, you will know this isn't about me, it's about them. And you can operate forward with that knowledge.
Absolutely. Such great advice. You've worked at some really great tech companies, some big tech companies, and I know you've worked with clients who work at companies of all sizes too. And I'm curious, when it comes to representation, I know I
Mm.
mentioned, how much it meant to me to see a woman like you in leadership when I came to Slack. But I'm curious from your experience, what have you seen work when it comes to increasing the number of women in leadership positions in the corporate world in a sustainable way? And what do you think companies need to do more of to create more spaces for women where they feel like they belong?
Yeah, representation starts with sponsorship, not mentorship. Those two things are not the same. Mentorship is advice. Sponsorship is someone putting their own credibility on the line for you in a room you're not in. Women in tech get plenty of feedback, but very little advocacy. And that's really what needs to change. So, what I've seen work are leaders who are explicit about creating stretch opportunities for women on their teams who don't always self-nominate, organizations that really look honestly at their succession planning for leadership and ask whose names are on those lists and why. And then companies that examine not just whether women leave, but what made staying feel impossible for them. So representation also on the hiring panel, which you've brought up now a couple of times, how meaningful that was for you, that does matter. And it doesn't just matter for the candidate, but I've watched pipeline conversations, the candidate pipeline conversations shift the moment a woman was in the room who could speak to what senior leadership actually requires day to day and representing how women lead. And it's not a small thing. It changes what people believe is possible for themselves. And the companies that get this right don't treat it as a diversity initiative. They treat it as a performance standard for their leaders.
That is so powerful, treating it as a performance standard versus a diversity initiative. Wow.
Yeah.
Like that's a huge, it's just a mindset shift and a perspective shift.
Yeah. And how that shows up, I'll give you a very tactical way that could show up. One thing I would ask all of my hiring leaders on my organization, and especially in the beginning of my pre-sales career, there was mostly men in the role and it was very hard to find women, so you had to get creative of not just pulling from your network and not just pulling from people who had done the role before. But one way I would do that would say, you're going to hire the best person for the role, and here's a more holistic way of looking at what that is defined as. And also, you need to have diverse candidates in the pool. I'm not saying you have to hire somebody because of because of their gender, but what I am saying is that you need to do the hard work to find the right candidates, because most often they're not in your direct network when it's a male-dominated industry. So you need to do that hard work and get creative and build your pipeline and expand your network and have them in the process. Because you would see often, a hiring process and all the candidates would be male. Like, no wonder women aren't getting hired. They don't even get in the door. And I don't think people were intentionally making those decisions. They're busy, they're leaders, they're pulling from the direct network, but they're also not being intentional about how they're hiring. And that's where you have to put specific measures in place to ensure it's a performance standard, not an initiative.
I'm really glad you expanded on that, because the end result is still the best candidate gets the job, right? But it's just diversifying that pool in the first place. So you're giving a greater diversity of candidates the opportunity to get the
Yeah.
job. Yeah.
Yeah.
And this is I was just talking to someone who was saying, referral programs can be great, but they can also be really limiting, because then you just get you get people referring the same people over and over
Yes.
again, right? Versus expanding that pool of applicants, which is similar to what you just said.
Yes. And then, there are other things like the job description, and the way that men and women might respond to a job description, and making sure it is a job description that would invite diverse candidates to even apply to begin with. So there's a lot of little tactical things you can do to ensure that you have a diverse team. I am incredibly proud of the pre-sales team we had at Slack. It was over 50% women, and the leadership was over 50% women. And in my first time in my career, and I trust me, I worked very hard to create diverse teams. I was very proud. And that came from an organization that did treat diversity as a performance standard. And it came from the top all the way down. So it shows when you're intentional, when a company is intentional, it can make a huge difference.
Absolutely. And I can certainly attest to that. That was the best team that I have ever worked on, like in any career that I've had, any company I've worked at, through my journalism career, through my tech career. And it was also an extremely high performing team. Like
Yes.
everyone on that team was an excellent, high achieving, high performing, over above and beyond innovative person. And yes, we had the best people. And it was extremely diverse, inclusive. And there was also, that kind of like magic that happens when you have a group of people who also have that mindset because everyone just got along, supported each other, and wanted to work together too.
Yeah, here's a fun fact. There's at one point one of the teams, because we were by industry, and one of the teams was all women, and it was the first time the diversity hiring had switched, where we needed to hire more men. And I was like, we did it. Like, I was so proud. I was like, that's amazing. And we did. We expanded the team. But I was like, wow, that's what happens when not only leaders are making that effort, but it is supported by the company and you're finding talented people. And yeah, it can be done. That's the short answer there. It can be done.
Yeah, wow.
You know,
So we've talked so much about your work in the corporate world, your success. You rose to these high levels at incredible companies, and then you made this decision to pivot to career coaching. So, when did you first consider building your own business as a career coach?
okay. So that seed was planted long before I ever acted on it. But the work I loved most in every leadership role I held was around the people. And specifically, it was around those conversations where I would ask someone, if you stripped away the title or where you thought you were supposed to go next, or the comp, or all of it, and just did one kind of work forever, what would it be? And then figuring out how to build towards that with them, again, aligning it with the business needs. And I realized that that was my edge in helping people do that. I just hadn't ever put like a name on it or thought about it, just when I thought it was part of leadership. But when I left Slack, something happened that I didn't expect. And when the announcement went out, the messages started coming in from people I had led, mentored, sponsored over the years. And what struck me was not that they were just kind, which they were, it was that they were very specific. And it was around how I had helped them see something in themselves they could not have seen on their own, how a conversation we had changed the direction of a decision, how they had more confidence walking in a room because of the work we had done together. And I had spent, over 25 years helping other people to find their edge. Those messages told me I had been doing it all along without ever putting a name to it. So I turned my framework on myself and I looked at my presence, everything I had built, who knew about it. And I thought about the moments that mattered most in my career, what gave me that energy, what I loved. And I got very clear on what I wanted to do next. And then there was something a little more personal at work. My father was an entrepreneur and he was very like scrappy and fearless, wasn't afraid of something failing. He built things from nothing. And he'd been such a mentor for me. And he had passed away almost to the day now, 5 years ago. And when I finally made that decision to launch on my own, it was like I could feel him cheering me on. And it was a very real energy for me. And I just grabbed onto it and I have not looked back. So when you do the work of getting clear on your edge and building the right presence, being ready for the moments that matter and staying connected to the people who will advocate for you, the path forward gets a little less scary. And, we talked about the four levers, and I had lived all four of those inside someone else's company for decades. So for me, it was time to live them for myself.
That's so beautiful. You had so many signs telling you that this is the direction you were meant to go in. And I love just that feeling when you said you could feel your dad's energy. There's something to be said for your body just telling you that everything is in alignment, right?
Yes.
And yeah, I think it's amazing that you had that both from the people who sent you all those messages and then from your dad. And clearly you've had this validation as well, given how quickly your business has grown in just the
Yes.
last year.
It's been very, very exciting. And I think I work more hours now than I ever did in any of my corporate work. But I can say I'm more energized by the work and I'm learning so much still. But I will say, like, it took me, right? I had a 30-year career, 25 years in leadership to get here. And part of what inspires me to do this work is I want to help people get there sooner.
Yeah.
And so I'm trying to share my experience of what I went through and my stories, but then also the frameworks that have been building over the years.
On that note, what is the best career advice you've received that you think everyone needs to hear?
Okay, so someone had shared this with me earlier in my career that if you do not tell your story, others will tell it for you, and they may not always get it right. And so I did carry that with me. And it's not about ego or self promotion, it's about information. When decision makers don't have that clear picture of your value, they fill in the blanks themselves and sometimes accurately, but not always. And by the time you realize that narrative is off, that decision may have already been made. So I would also add, though, and this is the part I wish someone had told me sooner, is that the clarity about your value is an act of generosity to the people who want to champion you. When you can articulate what you do and what you have built and where you're headed with specificity and confidence, you make it really easy for your sponsors to advocate for you. You're not asking them to do that translation work. You're handing them the words they can use. So clarity beats perfection every time, and it always will.
I love the way you worded that about how it's generosity to the people who want to champion you. Like, and first of all, it's so true. And just when you think about it practically, everyone is so busy. And so when you can
Yes.
give your leader that clear narrative that makes it easy for them, I mean, you're really like, you're making their lives easier and allowing them to support you in the way they want to. Plus, it does benefit you as it should.
Yes, and to give you like real example, I mean, I'd be in a room trying to advocate for someone on my team for promotion. I think they're a rock star, but sometimes teams are large, so other leaders like my peers that are also going to be in that room who are also trying to advocate for their teams in a limited budget may not have that exposure. So now I have 2 minutes to say why this person should get the promotion or the new opportunity, and no one else knows. Right. So now I have to try to have the words that I can use to land the person's value in a way that will get everyone else on board. And if I'm struggling for that, even if I've done my homework, if I don't have the language to use of why you're different, if you haven't worked with me to help build that, it's very hard for me to do that on your behalf. So it is generosity. You're helping those people that want to do that for you. And obviously, you're helping yourself.
Absolutely. Lori, this was such an insightful conversation. Thank you so much for everything you shared today. I know people are going to want to connect with you after this. So, what's the best way for people to find you?
Okay. Well, I would love to connect with folks. You can follow me on LinkedIn. I share insights weekly. And I also share playbooks on Substack. So LinkedIn and Substack is where you can find me. And I hope you do.
Perfect. Yes. And we will link to Lori's LinkedIn and also to her Substack in the show notes so you can find her more easily. Lori, thank you again so much. This was so great. I really enjoyed our conversation. And yeah, I'm just also excited to be on this coaching journey with you. I love that we went from working together to now like working together in a new
I
wing
know.
and being able to share insights with each other. It's been so fun to be on this journey with you.
Same, Priya. And I really appreciate you having me today. So thank you very much.
Yes, thank you. And thank you to all of you who joined us, who listened. Send Laurie and I messages on LinkedIn. We love hearing, what insights you took away from the episode. And if you enjoyed today's episode, please leave us a 5-star review. Make sure you follow and subscribe to the show so you never miss an episode. And I will see you next week on Unleash Your Voice.